शुभ नामे जागे, तब शुभ आशीष मांगे, गाहे तब जय गाथा। जन गण मंगलदायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता। जय हे जय हे जय हे, जय 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 हे।
Thank you. Thanks a lot. On behalf of our organizing chair, Dr. Sandeep Sattur, and the organizing team, I would like to welcome all the Board of Governors of AHRS, all the faculty, national as well as international faculty, and the fellow delegates. And not to go further, I would like to request our organizing chair, Dr. Sandeep Sattur, to come on the stage and start the proceedings of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, everyone. This particular scientific program, as conceived by the scientific committee, has tried to take into account the feedback that we have received from the last few conferences. The feedback has been to initiate more discussion, because at the end of the day, we would like to have a kind of a consensus on various topics that we are having. So the format is that we will have 4 or 5 lectures on a particular topic, followed by a panel discussion on that particular topic or those assorted topics, and probably hope to generate some kind of consensus at the end of that. To begin the session, I invite our moderator, Dr. Venkatram, to start the proceedings.
Good morning to all. It is very refreshing to see the conference start on time and after such a small inauguration. And Dr. Sattur has tried very hard to make this program very different, assisted ably by the young team of Kumaresan, Mayank and Sukhbir. So there is ample time for discussions. This has been one of the things in the past that there were less time for questions. I hope that will be taken care this time. So without much ado, let us start the first session, which is on biology of hair, to understand the pathogenesis and various other factors that go into hair loss. We have a very erudite panel of speakers. The first talk is by Dr. Sandeep Sattur himself, who is the organizing secretary of the conference, with a very keen interest in understanding hair science. I invite Dr. Sandeep Sattur to come onto the stage. One word of caution to all the speakers. Dr. Sattur has told me very strictly that if the speakers don't finish their talk at 12 minutes, the screen will go blank. So, Dr. Sattur, please come. The questions will be taken at the end in the panel discussion. I request all of you to note down, and then we'll take the questions in the panel discussion.
Thank you, sir, and I welcome you all again. What I'm sharing with you is the dilemmas and the issues that I have faced in about 2 decades of handling patients of hair loss. There is no one way to understand how the hair loss occurs in individual people. Our understanding of hair loss causes is based on 5 basic modalities, that is disturbed hair follicle cycling, unwanted hair follicle transformation, defective hair follicle regeneration, excessive exogen, and defective hair shaft structure. But what we see in practice is a combination of more than one of these factors. The problem begins with the fact that the nomenclature itself is where the problem starts. Commonly, the terms androgenetic alopecia and pattern hair loss are used interchangeably. That is not true for all patients. So a more encompassing term would be pattern hair loss, which will look at androgenic and non-androgenic pathways. By definition, I would say patterned, progressive, potentially reversible hair miniaturization limited to frontal central area of the scalp in genetically predisposed individuals. The thing about the pattern is consistent involvement of frontal, mid-scalp and crown areas and consistent sparing of occipital and occipital-parietal fringe. We know from time immemorial the observation that the androgens were responsible for causing the hair loss, basically based on the paradox of the way the androgens work with the hair follicle. The follicles that are responsible for expressing the secondary sexual characteristics in men are also the same factors that are responsible for causing hair loss in genetically predisposed individual. But there is another paradox which says that the androgen receptors are required within all hair follicles to achieve androgen-dependent hair growth. Now, the paradox here is that the female axillary and pubic hair will grow in spite of phi alpha reductase deficient individuals. So, androgen action is specific to an individual follicle and relates to its gene expression. We all know that the testosterone, when it's released and enters the hair follicle cells in the cytoplasm, meets the phi alpha reductase, gets converted to dihydrotestosterone, and this dihydrotestosterone is the preferred ligand for the androgen receptor. This combination of the receptor and the ligand move into the nucleus to initiate certain changes that result in the miniaturization. What I also feel that those patients who do not respond to finasteride, part of the action of the androgen is directly without converting to dihydrotestosterone, where in some individuals this may be a more predominant thing. Now this is something that is pretty well known as a hypothetical basis for why the miniaturization occurs because of the androgens. But because we know that all patients do not have a uniform response to finasteride in spite of the fact that androgens have impact on the hair follicle, and everybody's genetic antecedents are not very clear. So there is possibility of non-androgenic pathways operating which cause the pattern hair loss. Now, one of the things that put forward is perifollicular microinflammation. The area around the infundibulum is colonized by a lot of microbial species. This microbiome, which is created in this area, does lead to a fair bit of inflammatory changes. Now, this is not as severe as the ones seen in scarring alopecia. It's more of a mild indolent course which follows, leading to certain changes and release of inflammatory cytokines, which again impact the hair growth. Now, if I have to sum this up in a very simple flow chart, the cofactors that are responsible for this is something that Dr. Troob has very, very emphatically presented in all his presentations and his publications. And he believes that the inflammatory pathways need to be explored from a therapeutic perspective. Now, epigenetic changes are another thing that I would say are important for these situations. What I have seen in the last few years is that we are seeing a lot of patients who are younger who are presenting to us. Probably a bad lifestyle is something that causes these people to go into a metabolic syndrome. Carbohydrate consumption again is an important factor in these patients, and there have been enough linkages between metabolic syndrome and pattern hair loss. Insulin resistance is the key in many patients. In fact, we have been doing this for almost now a year. We have been taking the BMI of all our patients, irrespective of what they present. And they are hovering between normal weight and overweight, most of the BMIs that we see. Stress can be a factor. Now, there have been studies in the mice which have shown with the release of substance P that mitigates the cause of hair loss issues. A combination of psycho-emotional stress, metabolic syndrome can all ultimately lead to insulin resistance and finally an epigenetic change caused by DNA methylation leading to hair loss. Erector pili has also been implicated in these situations. Dr. Sinclair is very passionate about this. But what is seen from a clinical perspective is that Once the arrector pili muscle atrophies to a point, whatever medical therapy is going to be instituted is not going to be as effective. As long as the arrector pili muscle is still functional, you may have some benefits in using the medical therapy. The other thing that recently published is the retinoid receptor, particularly PPAR pathway. Now these things have been involved in the fat metabolism, but their important thing is that these, the upregulation of the PGCI in the inner and outer root sheath of the hair follicles, concomitant with the AR upregulation in the miniature hairs, indicates that there is another pathway from these receptors which may be responsible for the hair loss in these patients. So to sum it up, I would say it's a combination of genes, environment, hormones coming together to cause this problem. The degree of involvement of each of these factors will vary from person to person. Now, if I look at male pattern hair loss, the involvement of the hormones and genes will be more than the inflammation and the environment. In the females, probably the inflammation and the environmental issues will be much stronger than as per some studies which have looked at metabolic syndrome in women causing pattern hair loss as compared to men. So, from the perspective of looking at this, the genes, hormones and environment, including and with the inflammation, cause a local or a global impact for the hair follicle, which leads to decreased hair follicle density, decreased hair shaft thickness and decreased anagen dilution. All this leading to thinning and hair loss. So, from this perspective, it is important to understand that it is not possible to target the main causative elements in most cases. So, most medical treatments that we would implicate would be open-ended and not curative. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sattur, for a very nice talk and also a very well timed talk. As I said, please keep your questions. We'll take them at the end. Now, the next talk is going to be on genetic and epigenetic influences on hair loss by Dr. Kumaresan, who is one of our joint secretaries. He is also the coordinator for trichology in IADVL for the SIG there, Special Interest Group, and has previously presented some very fine papers in HairCons, and is also a very keen writer, has contributed to many chapters and articles. Dr. Kumaresan.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, delegates. I'll be presenting on genetic and epigenetic influences on androgenetic alopecia. This is going to be a very theoretical topic. I try to make this presentation as applied as possible. The familial occurrence of AGA is well documented. The monozygotic twins display a striking phenotypic resemblance in their baldness. And the twin studies on AGA in men have shown the generated heritability estimates of 0.81. This shows it's highly genetically inherited. There is always a fight in the family with the parents, like who is responsible for the baldness getting transferred to their children. Earlier it was thought that the AR gene located on X chromosome was considered as a major baldness causing gene, and hence this condition is inherited maternally. But we have observed baldness can be transmitted from the father's side also. This is an image of the famous royal family where we can clearly see the baldness can get transmitted from the father's side also, and they can be transmitted in different patterns in different generations. There are a lot of studies on the genetics of male pattern hair loss. When all the details are analyzed, it was found that there is a staggering 287 genes in total that is responsible for androgenetic alopecia. Among them, 40 are located on X chromosome alone. Among these 40, the androgen receptor gene is the major contributor in majority of the men that was studied. When you look at the distribution of the rest of the genes, almost every chromosome has at least one gene involved in expression of the baldness. Since androgenetic alopecia is a polygenetic condition, the genes are located in X chromosome and autosomes also. This shows that we have both androgenic and non-androgenic pathways. The involvement of so many genes is responsible for the clinical variations in androgenetic alopecia. We have so many different types of baldness, and we have different types of classification, but still there are some people who don't fit into any of these classifications The reason being the role of these multiple genes and the various combination of these genes. These are the major genes that have been studied for their role in androgenetic alopecia. They act either individually or interacting with each other. These genes alters the signaling pathways. Among the signaling pathways, there are two signaling pathways that has been extensively studied. One is androgen receptor signaling pathway and the other is WNT signaling pathway. Dysregulation of these signaling pathways leads to the following pathophysiological changes. It leads to androgen sensitivity of the hair follicles, short anagen, and premature catagen, leading to follicular miniaturization and finally baldness. This is how genes express the baldness. The female pattern hair loss genetics is so complex as a disease process itself. We do see men who have advanced rate of baldness still have girl children with good head of hair. So the hair loss in female should not be blamed on the father alone. The genes which are majorly implicated in men like androgen receptor and EDA2R doesn't seem to play a major role in female pattern hair loss. And all those genes that has been documented for their role in men doesn't seem to be overlapping for the female pattern hair loss. Possibly different set of genes could be playing a role in the pathogenesis. And there are some newer genes that has been identified for their role in male androgenetic alopecia that are yet to be studied for their role in female pattern hair loss. As of now, the genetics in female pattern hair loss, the data is very limited. We need more research on this topic. Genetics does influence the treatment response to androgenetic alopecia also. There is a variant repeat nucleotide, CAG nucleotide, located on exon 1 of AR gene in the X chromosome. Based on the number of CAG repeats, individuals can be classified into two categories, those who are androgen sensitive and those who are not androgen sensitive. People with less than 24 CAG repeats in gene generally tend to have a better response to finasteride, and those who have greater than 24 CAG repeats seems to be poor responders to finasteride. This could be used as a genetic test to pick those individuals who can respond to finasteride better. Similarly, there is a study that analyzed the efficacy of dutasteride according to the genetic variation in men. The gene changes in the following genes in the study population was used to categorize the study population to two groups, poor responders and good responders to dutasteride. Hence, these type of genetic tests can be utilized to assess the treatment response among patients with androgenetic alopecia. Minoxidil is one of the commonly used medication for androgenetic alopecia. It's a prodrug. It's converted by enzyme minoxidil sulfotransferase to minoxidil sulfate, which is an active ingredient. Those people with a particular genotype, GG genotype, in their sulfotransferase gene seems to respond to minoxidil better than those without that particular genotype. Hence, this can be used as a genetic test to predict the response to minoxidil among the study population. And the studies have documented that only 40 to 50% of the population has this particular genotype. This explains why not all patients respond to minoxidil uniformly. So now we have some genetic tests to identify those people who may respond better to the standard medications. Till now we have seen the genetics of the disease process, genetics of the treatment response. But in our clinical practice, we have seen some families where the baldness history is very strong, but still some of their children, they don't develop baldness. Likewise, those people who don't have a baldness history in the family, still some children go on to develop baldness. And very rarely in twins, one twin has good hair, good hair, and the other twin is completely bald. This is a twin of Vin Diesel. And this is a common question which we face in our practice also. The answer for these questions is epigenetics. Epigenetics is a fascinating study in genetics now. It is a study of biological mechanisms that switches on and off the genes. This is a mechanism by which a cell reads its own DNA. Cancer was the first disease where epigenetics was implicated as a major role in the pathogenesis. Now we have a lot of other conditions where epigenetics being implicated, and androgenetic alopecia is one among them. Literally, epigenetics means two genetically identical individuals with the same genome can have different phenotype. That's because their cells read their DNA in a different language due to their epigenetic influences. What are these epigenetic influences? It could be practically anything, right from our diet, exercises, exposure to toxic chemicals, smoking, alcohol, drug abuse, our exercises, sense of well-being, emotional stress, everything contributes to the epigenetic factors. The influence of these epigenetic factors starts in utero and continues throughout our life till death. These changes in epigenetic factors makes every individual unique. Although we have a common genome, every individual is unique because of these epigenetic factors on the genes. And these changes can be inherited to multiple generations. The bad lifestyle which we follow might influence our genes that can be carried through our future generations also. And one good thing is that these epigenetic factors has been documented to be reversible. NASA has done a twin study in male. These two are astronauts, famous Kelly brothers. One astronaut was sent to space, the other brother was on Earth. And for a particular time, the epigenetic influence on the genome was studied, and it was found that 7% of the genome changed when this brother was in the space. And all these changes reversed once he landed on Earth. 90% of changes got reversed. This shows that epigenetic changes can be reversed. And this is a good news. A good lifestyle can reverse all the epigenetic changes in our genes. How these epigenetic changes influence our DNA? By a process called methylation. Histones are the basic units of DNA, and these epigenetic factors create a chemical reaction leading to methylation of this DNA, and particularly methylation of histone. Methylation of histone makes good genes masked, bad genes expressed, maybe overexpressed, and a lot of other permutations and combinations. This is how epigenetic factors influence the expression of genes and how the cell reads its own DNA in a different manner. It was found that the occipital hair is generally spared when compared to the frontal hair under androgenic influence. One of the reasons could be epigenetic influence on the androgen receptor genes on the occipital region. The AR genes on the occipital region has been found to have higher methylation when compared to those follicles in the frontal region. And it was found that lack of DNA methyltransferase leads to baldness. And there is a study that analyzed the role of epigenetic factors in twins with androgenic alopecia. It is clearly documented epigenetic factors does affect the expression of baldness, and it is more in those people who follow a very bad lifestyle. To conclude, androgenic alopecia is a polygenic condition. It involves a huge number of genes. We have a total of 287 genes involved. Female pattern hair loss genetics still need to be studied in detail. Till now, we don't have any genetic test to identify those people who are predisposed to develop androgenic alopecia. We have some genetic tests to assess the treatment response in individuals to minoxidil, finasteride, and dutasteride. And epigenetic factors does influence the expression of baldness, and this is an area for future research, and our future treatment modalities will be more based on epigenetic factors in future. And bald men are still considered to be attractive. If baldness is a phenotype that was considered repulsive to females, then by evolution, all men would have lost all the baldness causing genes. But fortunately or unfortunately, it did not happen. We retained the baldness genes, and we have this field of trichology and hair transplantation now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very nice talk on genetics and epigenetic influences. Thank you, Kumaresan. Now we have our international faculty, Dr. Samuel Lamb, to speak on donor dominance and recipient site influence, impact on hair transplant outcomes. Dr. Lamb is from Dallas in USA, where he runs a hair transplant center. He is a facial plastic surgeon and a fellow of ISHRS. He is the president-elect of the American Board of Hair Restoration Surgeons and has written a very nice textbook on hair transplantation. He also runs a very successful conference on hair transplantation at his place. Dr. Samuel Lamb, please.
धन्यवाद. नमस्ते. मुझे यहाँ आमंत्रित करने के लिए धन्यवाद. We all know about donor dominance, courtesy of Norman Orangereich, so I'm not going to go into details about that. So we want to talk about this into what do we mean by recipient influences. So clearly, we all think that if we transplant hairs into the eyebrow, it could grow more slowly. Could the beard be different after transplantation? How about if we take scalp hair and put it in the beard? What if, I mean, into the beard, or the beard into the scalp, or the scalp into the chest? So we have to figure this out. And I may raise more questions and give you answers during this. So I took a survey of some of the people that I know, my friends who do a lot of eyebrow transplants, and is there a change to the eyebrows after a year of transplantation? Do they grow more slowly? Are they finer? I'm not convinced of it, and a lot of my colleagues are uncertain or they don't believe so. There was a study in leprosy cases that showed that there was actually a slowdown of the grafts growing in the eyebrow. They became less gray and changed. So maybe there is a role. I don't think there's a consensus on this. I asked my colleague, Tommy Wong, who did a study in 2005 taking chest hair and moving it to the scalp. And he put it into just one area. The rest was done with scalp hair. And he found that after about a year of the procedure, he looked at what happened, and he found that the chest hairs grew as long as the scalp hairs. And if you guys do those kind of transplants, you'll probably see that. And then I asked my colleague and friend Bob True, and he said, yeah, he actually has noticed the same thing, and he found that the hairs over time become actually straighter. So that's something to think about. Are there recipient influences that are present? On the flip side, are there donor influences? So I asked my colleague, Paco Jimenez, who's the current president of the ISHRS, as you know, about this study where he looked at ulcers. So what he did in the study was he took half a wound with the punch grafts from the abdominal area, just skin only, and then he took some that had hair-bearing tissue into a split wound. And as you look at this progression and you go all the way to 18 months, you can clearly see the inferior aspect of this wound with the transplanted hair grafts show two things. One, they actually healed so much better in these diabetic ulcers. And the second thing you see is the hair grafts didn't survive. So, you know, people always worry about putting hair grafts into areas of, you know, where there shouldn't be hair. You may consider doing it based on some of his studies. I think it's very interesting. So the hair grafts don't survive for the most part, but the wound heals itself. So some of those thought processes out there, for example, you may have noticed in your work, if you put hair grafts into scars, that the scars soften and they may take up better grafts on a second session. So these are all controversies. There's no clear, large-scale, multi-center study that can be cited. So in my own cases, you know, I was asked to do this talk, so I started to think back in a lot of this retrospectively. So I haven't analyzed in detail these patients, but I just sort of think in retrospect. So here's a gentleman that presented to me in 2005 or 6, you know, class 5, 6 balding, clearly pretty extensive in nature, but pretty miniaturized throughout. Did a transplant on him, started on medical therapy. This is probably about 9 months out. I did not transplant his crown. He's just, some of that is regrown through medical therapy and also through the way he combs his hair. And then he came back to me in 2014, about 6 years later or so, after the initial treatment, roughly, and all of a sudden he's lost all this hair. And he still has some of the transplanted hairs there, but I was devastated and wondered what happened. And this rarely occurs, but I see it. So then you start thinking, well, is it donor dominance in terms of the fact that there's just miniaturization in the donor area that I didn't diagnose or that progressed in nature so that over time he actually had a DUPA? Or was it the fact that there was recipient influences causing those grafts to lose? I'm sure all of you who are experienced hair surgeons have a minority of patients like this. So I looked into his donor area, and there was some miniaturization, but he underwent another linear strip procedure and was started on medical therapy. And the question then is, look at his crown. I didn't transplant his crown, but his crown regrew. So clearly, there were some influences of the miniaturization reversing even those that are completely bald. As you know, that a completely bald scalp still has hairs underneath the skin. So they're there. So could it be a combination? Maybe that some of his donor hairs that miniaturized over time regrew, or was it the fact that he just regrew a lot through medical therapy? So the take-home lesson is we always see these cases and we shy away from them, and rightly so, these DUPA cases that are quite obvious from a distance. You can see this from a mile away, but then sometimes I've been shocked. I do a surgical case and I go and I start looking at even more carefully, and there's a higher level of miniaturization than I even thought or saw dermoscopically initially. There was just things that I may have missed, and then there can be problems by missing this. And this is a gentleman that presented to me that had a multiple linear strips done elsewhere, followed by an FUE over harvesting. So, and then he has extensive miniaturization and he refuses medical therapy. Sir, you're a perfect candidate for a good transplant result. No, I'm just joking. But this is clearly a disaster. So, you know, the first option is just to say, I'm sorry, sir, if you don't take medical therapy, if you don't want to be part of this, you know, send him on his way. And that's clearly a reasonable option if a patient is not going to be compliant. But the question is, what is going on? You know, clearly the number one problem is bad judgment and poor technique. But also it's prediction. If you look at how extensively miniaturized he is, what would you do in this case? Would you just send him packing? So I did a limited procedure of FUE into the scar as well as SMP into the scar. He refused medical therapy. I documented everything. And this is not a great result, but at least maybe buys him some years. But what is going to happen in 10 years? You know, I did a very conservative SMP because what if that hair grays? What if he loses more hair? There's so many issues here for someone that is not fully compliant. This is another gentleman that I did a linear strip procedure on, and I made some judgment issues here that I think are wrong. He had a pretty dark hair in the central area, and after transplantation, you can see that it doesn't look right. There's just too much dark in the front. I presented this, actually my assistant presented this in the assistant section of St. Louis, and someone said, no, it's actually, he has seen a recipient site change where actually the hairs turn darker. You know, we often think it turns lighter when we place in the temple, but he said, no, I've seen it where it turns darker. So maybe this is a combination of both. Is it which one? I don't know. I mean, this is all very, you know, when I was asked to do this talk, I had to think back on my cases. What examples? There's a gentleman who progressed to a Norwood 7, 6-7 with thinning all throughout, and he has bad hair grafts on the left. So this is several sessions of 100% beard transplant, and this is done over time. Now the question is, do his hairs look better now because of recipient influences where the beard grafts became finer, or did because his beard grayed out that it became grayer so then it looks more natural, or was it the fact that he has so much more density from multiple rounds of beard transplant that now you don't see his previous grafting? I don't know. I mean, I wish I could sit up here and give you a consensus and just give you a simple answer. But I don't know, you know, and I think that what's challenged me doing this talk is going back and looking at these cases more in depth. So here's his crown. This is after about 3 rounds of beard transplantation and also some medical therapy. And this is over several years. So if you look up close, are his grafts finer? Are they better? Or is it the graying? Or is it the multiple transplant? Or is it the fact that his medical therapy has given him some fine hairs to blend in with his other hairs? I don't know. I wish I could just tell you it's one of, and maybe it's all. As you heard from Dr. Satur, there's multiple factors. And I agree with male hair loss, there's so many factors. It's nutritional, it's epigenetic, it's genetic. There's so many factors. So here's another view, and what's going on? Is it close-up range? I think it's all of them. To be honest with you, I think it's some recipient influence, I think it is some medical therapy, and I think it's some graying of his hair. But the other take-home lesson from this is look at the judgment issues, multiple strips done elsewhere, all over the place with advanced baldness caused a lot of issues for this gentleman. This is a gentleman here who came to me with a linear strip procedure done elsewhere, with a lot of his grafts miniaturized, and so almost looks as if it's just male pattern baldness with some retained frontal hair. But those are actually transplanted hairs that have been miniaturized. So I just put him on medical therapy, well, you saw that. And the backside, look at how much growth there is in there, and look at his donor hair. That's really dupa. You know, this is he has got miniaturization throughout. So clearly, either the grafts got better, because they were reversed, because look at what happened to his donor hair. His donor hair, where the strip was taken, reversed as well. And the scar that was bothering him also got covered for now. So the consensus is, in my opinion, there is not an easy consensus on this, but I think the consensus, if we have one, is the fact that it's multifactorial. I don't think it's so easy to say just because I can show you one case where there's recipient influence that that's the dominant issue, or oh my God, if there's donor influence, that's got to be the case in every situation, because it's so variable, absolutely variable. But it's challenging me as a surgeon to look prospectively at my cases more attentively, whereas in this exercise I was talking about retrospective cases, which I wish I could go back and look at those cases more in detail, microscopically. So DUPA is a spectrum. Keep in mind, look carefully dermoscopically, look at it surgically, look at those cases where there is cases where, we define DUPA as over 25%. What if there's 12%? What if there's 20%, 23% miniaturized hairs? Does that count? And just don't count on recipient influences. Don't say, well, there's going to be recipient influence. We don't know. And always look at the fact that you've got so many tools in your belt. And this is why I encourage you to be diligent about medical therapy. Think about scalp micropigmentation. If you don't have an artist to do good work, have someone work with you on SMP. Be able to be diligent in doing both FUE and linear strip if possible. And also the best option sometimes is don't do anything at all. And I'm on the scientific committee for Panama, and I'll be running the advanced board review, so I encourage all of you to come. As you know, I'm the vice president and the incoming president for the ABHRS. I encourage you, you can ask me questions about that, the exam. I'll be running that exam in Panama. And I don't make any money on any of these courses I run, but I encourage you to come in July of this year to St. Louis. It is really for beginners. I mean, if you're advanced, you may get something out of it, but it really is for beginners to intermediate. And what I always tell people out there is that it's not just about what you listen to me lecture, or you watch me talk, or you watch me operate. When I watch you do the work, I know within a minute how to correct some issues. Literally, I mean, I can see, I go, okay, your major problem, your recipient sites are too close, they're too far apart, they're not consistent, your hairline is asymmetric, it's down tilting. And then I come back with a small group environment, and within minutes, I see the corrections. And I use a Socratic method of education where we talk to each other, and I say, okay, you tell me what's wrong with this hairline design that this gentleman did. So very passionate about that. Again, I have no financial disclosures on any books or anything. All my money goes to charity. It actually, as you know, a huge problem in India and across the world is human trafficking. The money that from my books goes to stop human trafficking. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lam, for a very nice talk there. Recipient influence and donor dominance to an extent are contrasting influences, so we'll discuss this again later. Now I have pleasure in inviting Dr. Rachita Durhat to speak on the role of sebaceous gland in hair growth and hair loss. Dr. Rachita is the professor and head here in Mumbai KM Medical College. She has been working in the field of trichology for nearly a decade now and has very many publications. She seems to publish one a month these days. And she also runs a very successful course, trichology course. Her training program in trichology is one of the most sought after in India. And I'm sure we will learn a lot about the role of sebaceous gland. Dr. Rachita.
Very good morning. The extension of this recipient and donor dominance theory, I would like to talk about role of sebaceous gland in hair growth. Now, if you look at what is a function of sebaceous gland, everyone would say that, yeah, sebum production, and sebum is very good for hydration of skin and water repulsion. It is antioxidant and antimicrobial. That's all. No, it has many, many important roles to play in hair biology. If you look at this hair follicles, each sebaceous gland is independently maintained by a dedicated stem cells. And here you can see actually, I don't know whether you can appreciate you can appreciate oil droplets also. And this is the structure of sebaceous gland and arrector pilar muscle, where the bulge region is located close proximity to sebaceous gland. Sebocytes are actually a terminally differentiated epithelial cells, and we know that these terminally differentiated epithelial cells have potential for regeneration. Each hair follicle acts independently of its neighbors and undergoing cyclical transition. With this knowledge, apart from sebum production, sebaceous gland functions are the ligands of receptor expressed in sebocytes. And what they do, they are for androgen estrogens, PPAR ligands, and neuropeptide, liver X receptors, and histamine, and others. Now, these ligand receptor complexes activate pathway involving not only sebum production, the cell proliferation, differentiation, lipogenesis, hormone metabolism, and cytokine and chemokine release. Now, if you look at, apart from that, it is a source for neurohormones, okay? And these neurohormones will understand corticotropin sebaceous hormone, how it plays a role in hair regrowth. Now, sebocytes also capable of producing a wide range of cytokines and lipid-derived mediators. Now, having said that, what happens during the hair transplantation? There are many stresses are involved. And these stressors induce corticotropin-releasing hormone production in hair follicles, which increases mast cell number and maturation via stem cell factor. And in addition, this corticotropin-releasing hormone causes degranulation of mast cells, which may induce catagen by chemical mediators from the mast cells. So that made me to think that when we have the hair transplantation, we get is hair loss because of catagen induction. That is very well known. So can we use any mast cell stabilizer to prevent that? There aren't any study for that, but this is my thought. Now, apart from that, sebaceous glands are thought to facilitate coordinated breakdown of inner root sheath during hair cycle, and this is very critical for follicular regeneration. For that, we need to understand this model, that is Eusebia mice. Now, what is Eusebia mice? Is a mice carrying Eusebia mutation where you have defective sebaceous glands. Now, if you have the defective sebaceous gland, what could be the consequences? Now, consequences are there is a progressive alopecia which increases with age and also in severity with successful cycles. And eventually what you see in this image is that you get a scattered hair over the period of time. So let's understand how it works. Now, there is occlusion of follicular os when you have the defective function of sebaceous gland. And thereby, there is a retention of, can I have the pointer, please? They have a retention of hair follicular shaft within the follicles. And what happens? There is a deeper extension of follicles to the depth of anagen follicle. And with that, there is eventually rupture of formation of foreign body granuloma. So this is a way when you have the defective sebaceous gland. Okay, thank you. Now this explains the importance of sebaceous gland in sheath shaft dissociation, which is important. Now we'll come to this PPAR. Now it has been proven that defect in this can lead to destruction of sebaceous gland, and thereby there is a permanent loss of hair follicles. And this is a cause for primary cicatricial alopecia. Now, what are these? PPAR is a ligand-activated nuclear receptor that regulates the transcription of various genes, which is highly expressed in sebaceous gland. It plays a role in lipid homeostasis, sebocyte maturation, peroxisome biogenesis, and has shown anti-inflammatory effects. Now, when there is a disruption of this ligand, is believed to be mechanism for primary cicatricial alopecia, and it is been proven beyond the doubt. Now, let's come to reperfusion injury, which happens during our hair transplantation. Now, apart from many dysregulation during this post-surgical events, the phospholipase are activated during ischemia, degrading membrane lipids, increasing levels of circulating fatty acid. Now, why it is important? Phospholipases regulate homeostasis of sebaceous glands. Now, the contribution of erector muscle and sebaceous gland we'll understand now. If you look at erector muscle, this is erector muscle, and the bulge connection persists throughout the hair growth cycle. Okay, and now, so APM plays an important role in morphogenesis and renewal of hair follicles that we know. But what we do not know that there is a branching, as Dr. Lamb said, there is a branching of erector muscle distally as well as proximally. However, in the distally, it occurs in a C-shaped structure. And each APM attaches to dermoepidermal junction at multiple points after dividing into multiple branches. So it is not, it is a one branch it was thought to be. Apart from that, distal APM may contribute to formation of a niche for epidermal stem cells, and as the proximal muscle does for follicular stem cells. So when you are cutting this erector muscle, probably that could be playing a role in hair loss in consecutive years to come. Signals from APM may contribute to regulation of both stem cells population. So we require the signal. So why I am saying so about this importance of sebaceous gland, we have seen that sebaceous gland, there is a disruption, there is complete knockdown of hair follicle causing complete permanent loss of hair. So over the period of time, when we see that hair loss happening after hair transplantation, it can happen after completion of first cycle or it could be second, third cycles. That depending on the patient to patient, and therefore we see hair loss in some patients after few years of hair transplantation. And this is the importance of when you understand the sebaceous gland and the surrounding structure of sebaceous gland, that is APM, then you know why they get hair loss despite of hair transplantation. So when we think of donor dominance and recipient dominant, this theory should also be not put forward this, but I would like to put forward this theory that definitely there is a role of sebaceous gland. With this, I invite you for 5th annual conference to Trichology Update, which will be happening in June 2020 between 12 to 14 at Hotel Lalit. And this is, thank you very much.
That was a very nice talk on a topic which has not been very well understood, nor has it been discussed much in most of our conferences. Thank you, Dr. Chita. Now I invite Dr. Aseem Sharma to speak on the role of nutrition in hair follicle physiology. Dr. Aseem is one of our most promising young dermatologists. He served in the Indian Air Force and now he is settled in Mumbai. He works with the team of Dr. Rachita and is part of most of the work of Dr. Chita and has published many, many publications on this. So he will speak on a topic which is of increasing interest, role of nutrition. Dr. Aseem.
So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My work has been made very easy by Dr. Satur and the previous speakers, who've already given you a brief overview about nutrition. Let me take that forth. So before I start, just a quick show of hands. How many of you in the audience give nutrition or nutritional supplements with a target or without a target in mind? So that's almost all of you. So you do believe in the science, or at least the method of giving supplements. Let's go over the science once. So androgenetic alopecia, two distinct components, genetics and androgens, which we are aware of. Let's look at the genetic part. Again, Dr. Kumaresan brought out very valuable points on epigenetics, or phenotypic expression of genotypes. So in this study, two identical twins, the AGA differed in pattern, onset, progression, and even grade, which goes to show that endogenous factors or phenotypic expression is as important as the genotype that a person is born with. And these are the factors which can cause epigenetic alterations, as has been brought out in the previous presentation. So to prove the point further, a concordance study in AGA done with 148 monozygotic and dizygotic twins. You can see the variance between fraternal and identical twins, which is known to us. The important point I want to drive across is, with the 79% heritability that comes with genetics, you have a 21% dependency on environmental expression. So that is again an important point to take home, I feel. This is where nutrition comes into play. We all know that iron, copper, and zinc, and many other cofactors induce nucleic acid metabolism and may have a role in epigenetic transformation. The second faction of AGA, androgens. So, no doubt, there are studies that have shown that increased dihydrotestosterone is one of the mainstays of androgenetic alopecia. I totally agree with that. This study, frontal alopecia has a higher production rate of DHT as compared to vertical alopecia, as compared to controls or people with normal hair patterns. But there are so many studies wherein AGA, male androgenetic alopecia, has been reported without an obvious biochemical increase in DHT. So what happens here, which is purported as non-hormonal hair loss, which occurs via transforming growth factor beta 1 and the Dickoff pathway. So it is not only the increase in DHT, but an altered follicular response, which we need to look at as well, as brought out by so many of these studies. Female pattern hair loss, the name says it all. It is much beyond only androgens and genetics. Pediatric genetic alopecia, 655 kids studied, only 14.7% of them had abnormal hormonal studies. The rest, 85%, occurs without any biochemical alterations. So, even the pathomechanisms of androgenetic alopecia have been revised from a simple spectral miniaturization from terminal hair and an increase in just DHT. We know that the follicular sensitivity to DHT is of paramount importance. The role of the sebaceous gland has been brought out beautifully by Professor Rachita. Epigenetics by Dr. Kumaresan. We have peripylar microinflammation, which is again one of the pathomechanisms in AGA. We have ECM degradation, which I'll be covering in subsequent slides, and oxidative stress. So let's look at ECM degradation first. So the factors that I mentioned about epigenetics, a similar set of factors disintegrates the ECM. The golden anchorage model, it basically weakens the hair. And as you can see in this trichoscopic photograph, the targets that I've shown, out of 4 hair strands in a single follicle, 1 or 2 will undergo preferential conversion, the rest 2 are spared. So does that have something to do with nutrition? So because of nutrient deficiency, you have reactive oxygen species in the dermal papilla, which cause ECM disintegration, weakening of the anchorage, as well as a change in the immune signature. So all of this undoubtedly alters follicular physiology. So let's look at some more evidence. When it comes to oxidative stress, I've already mentioned this at the beginning. So reactive oxygen species bind with the intracellular proteins. They alter the signature by triggering antigens, immune response, and also triggering, potentially, autoimmunity. Activation, so conversely, if you activate free radical scavengers, the hair cycle can be restored, as shown in the study wherein mast cells, lipid peroxidation, superoxide dismutase, and glutathione peroxidase were given, which restored the hair cycle. Another scavenger of the reactive oxygen species is N-acetylcysteine, which also reduces androgen-inducible TGF-beta1. Now, that's an important point. Transforming growth factor beta-1 is long thought to be only androgen-inducible, but we have N-acetylcysteine, which has reversed that effect. Tocopherols, tocotrienols, these are vitamin E derivatives, the saturated and unsaturated ones. They've shown a 34% increase in hair count and hair weight, again bypassing the reactive oxygen species. Supplementation with vitamin D, zinc, magnesium, selenium, and cofactor Q10, as shown in many studies, reduces the inflammation over the scalp. When it comes to diet and inflammation, high glycemic index foods, saturated fatty acids, monosaturated, unsaturated fatty acids, and even the imbalance between polyunsaturated fatty acids, which is the imbalance between omega-3 and omega-6, has shown to induce pro-inflammatory cytokines. Again, the same point reiterated. So zinc is one of the most versatile micronutrients that we have. I'll be coming to the various functions that zinc has. The follicles are a big and significant store of ferritin. These are conserved during systemic crisis and utilized for more vital functions. So hair, which is luxuriously rich in proteins, vitamins, and minerals, is given away, or the ferritin and zinc stores are taken away from the hair and redistributed to other tissues in times of crisis. So now there is so much talk about nutritional deficiency, but where is the biochemical evidence? Whenever we get tests done for patients and iron comes, ferritin levels are normal, we still give iron. What is the answer for that? So the answer was given by this gentleman. Apart from Dr. Rajput, if anybody can tell me who this is. So this is Dr. Yoshinori Osumi. In 2016, he won the Nobel Prize for Medicine for his breakthrough work on autophagy. Autophagy is nothing but a partial internal self-destruction to recover nutrients. So the anagen follicles are sacrificed to bring out nutrients to redistribute to other organs in times of crisis, like I had mentioned. Which is why, because of this redistribution, there is clinically undetectable nutritional deficiency which occurs. Let's look at more specifics. The follicular morphogenesis has 3 distinct phases: the induction phase, the organogenesis phase, and the cytodifferentiation into terminal hair phase. Vitamin D3 has been shown in various studies to have an inductive role in genesis because it acts directly through the Wnt pathway, which is the master regulator of the hair follicle. The arachidonic acid pathway again promotes organogenesis via various mechanisms. This works through the sonic hedgehog and the noggin pathway. Copper, another brave and very significant micronutrient, causes cytodifferentiation and again works on the dermal papilla through the bone morphogenetic pathway and the SOX2 pathway. So there was an expert consensus in 2017 on vitamins which are and are not good for us. So for vitamin A, they mentioned that hypervitaminosis causes a loss of, a paradoxical loss of hair because it disintegrates the epithelium. Riboflavin, cyanocobalamin may have a role. Vitamin C, D, and E have documented effects in various studies. I want to shift your focus to the crowd favorite biotin here. So biotin has been reported as, it's a part of so many nutritional supplements and it's been studied over the years. It definitely has a role to play, nobody's doubting that. But studies of late have shown that there is a lack of sufficient evidence for supplementation in healthy individuals. I would like to quote this study from Jerry Shapiro. Societal infatuation with biotin supplementation is not only propagated by its glamorization in popular media, its popularity is vastly disproportionate to the insufficient clinical evidence supporting its efficacy in hair improvement. My aim here is not to destroy biotin. My aim is to tell you that there are things beyond biotin. Biotin is not the only nutritional supplement that should be given in hair loss. And FDA has recently issued a warning, I'm sure most of you are aware, that biotin therapy interferes with certain laboratory tests, namely troponin and thyroid function tests. So beware of those. Just be mindful of those when you're getting these tests done. So just to recap, an evidence-based summary of the nutrients that actually work: reactive oxygen species scavenging, immune regulation, the follicular induction, genesis and differentiation, downregulation of these gene signaling pathways, and gene expression itself, or epigenetics. There are changing trends, some points to ponder. We are a race which is overeating, but we're undernourished. There is this hidden nutritive hunger which nobody speaks about. Over the last few years, there has been a decline in the agrarian quality in terms of the nutritive value of crops. So to conclude, non-hormonal hair loss is on the rise. Nutrition does play a pivotal role in follicular physiology. Vasodilatation by agents like minoxidil and peptides with hyponutrition is a futile exercise. Overeating and undernutrition are the norm of the day, and there is an unsaid need to correct nutritive deficiencies and hidden hunger, so to speak, to boost other treatments. I'd like to acknowledge the following people for helping me prepare the presentation. And I'll leave you, I'm not boasting of my photography skills here, I'll leave you with a traditional Indian meal which is rich in everything that you can think of. All the micronutrients that I've mentioned, the legumes for zinc, the spinach for selenium, the dairy product for vitamin B12, the iron stores, the omega-3 and 6 fatty acids in the fish, the mutton which is good in iron. So much. So I think it's time to get back to our roots and, stick to good old Indian meals. Thank you.
Thank you, Asim, for a very interesting talk on nutrition. I also thank all the speakers for finishing their talks well ahead in time. So that gives us good time to have an interesting discussion now. So I invite all the speakers to come onto the stage. Asim, Dr. Rachita, Sandeep, Kumaresan. Asim is left alone this side. Okay, there are two mics. Now I don't want Asim to be left alone, so I want to invite Dr. Rajput to come and sit here. Because when we are speaking of nutrition, I'm sure his views will be welcome. Now, this will be an interactive session, so I encourage all of you to ask questions. Please write down on a slip of paper, and somebody will from here will come and collect it. They have been instructed? Yeah. And please ask lots of questions. These questions, this session is meant as much for you as for me. Yeah, I think that will be. Please mention your name, and then I will read out. If there is any clarification, then we'll ask. Now, this is the objective of this discussion, which we have finished now. Now, one of the things Dr. Sandeep Sattur wants is, he wants us to come to some kind of summary and conclusion, which he will record it so that they can be circulated later. So we'll try and do that. It is a new experiment. Let us see if we can do that. Now, the first question here, Dr. Kumaresan, why should occipital area be spared in pattern hair loss? Why should pattern hair loss be a pattern type?
Embryologically, the occipital skin derived from a different part, on the front and parietal area derived from different parts.
Yeah,
That's
but
one
why
of
should
the-
still it be spared?
And as I presented, the occipital hairs has a lot of DNA methylations. That genetic change makes them immune to the influence of androgenic effects.
Sandeep, the pattern hair loss in men occurs where there is Galea.
There is Galea.
Occurs where there is Galea aponeurotica. Where it is not there, it doesn't happen. So what is the relation of that to pattern hair loss?
There is a paper that has been published which has talked about the expansion of the skull leading to changes in the skin dynamics and thereby causing loss in the specific areas that we see. But if you look at the way the skull grows, that is not compatible with what the conclusions of that paper was. Primarily, the reason the occipital area is spared is a part of an evolutionary perspective, because we don't have pinpoint answers to why occiput is spared. But as we have evolved from a hairy ape to a naked ape, the evolution that has happened in terms of hair-bearing, terminal hair-bearing areas, they have shrunk in more ways than one. So evolutionary perspective is one, and the epigenetic thing that there is increased methylation of the androgen receptors in the occipital area, which is also responsible for sparing the occipital hair from the androgen response.
Can I answer that?
Yeah.
The role of Galea aponeurotica plays major role. Now it is a newer concept that it creates a hypoxia. And during the hypoxia, the conversion of testosterone to DST is enhanced. And therefore, there is increased DST. And when you reverse with botulinum toxin. You relax that muscle with the botulinum toxin. We have seen the results with the botulinum toxin, the improvement in androgenetic alopecia. This is a theory put forward by only few papers have been published recently.
Anybody else on this topic? There is actually an interesting paper. I don't know how much proof is there for that hypothesis. The tension created by Galea, like Dr. Rachita explained, may in some way be responsible, leading to a host of changes from microinflammation, perifollicular fibrosis, altered blood supply, and that may also explain why some grafted hairs undergo miniaturization in the course of time.
The paper on the botulinum toxin injection, if you look at the type of study and the level of evidence that comes across is not really that I would say a very high level of evidence. It is speculative at this point of time, because the expression of DH, the 5-alpha reductase in areas where there is hair loss is always going to be more. They have proved repeatedly that the expression of 5-alpha reductase is more, and hence the DHT conversion locally is there. But like Dr. Asim said, in most cases of male pattern hair loss, there is never a pronounced biochemical change in any of the androgen profile. So it is not to think that serum androgen levels have been impacted. It is the sensitivity to the androgen that has changed. Okay. And that is what I had mentioned in the talk.
Yes, Dr. Lam.
Question and comment. Very interesting. I use botulinum toxin for everything, for scars, pain, everything. And there's been a study where they did a prospective randomized placebo-controlled split scar evaluation where it just takes away the you don't even get a scar in a thyroid, post-thyroid incision. And the speculation is that it downregulates transforming growth factor beta 1. Dr. Sharma, you mentioned about TGF beta 1. I didn't quite catch that slide. Was it the fact that TGF beta 1 is implicated in AGA, or is that a positive or negative factor? Because if it's a
negative factor.
So that's interesting. So maybe if botulinum toxin has been shown to reduce TGF beta 1, that could be another proposed mechanism by which it reduces AGA. Very interesting.
Yeah, this is the last question on this topic. We have a host of other topics to cover.
We though follow the TGF pathway, the DKK1 pathway, and the Sonic-Hedgehog pathways. These are the main pathways we are following for androgenetic alopecia. But I would like to make a point that these pathways are not specific to hair. These are generalized pathways, mediators of altered inflammation and immunity in the body. They are affecting the hair. But TGF-beta, DKK1, is raised in all conditions right from atopic allergic dermatitis to psoriasis. It changes in all these situations. We are looking at it only from the hair perspective. But these are generalized pathways influencing inflammation and immunity in the body.
Thank you. We also need to now summarize here that we feel that there are other influences other than the androgens which may be important, and this is, while some of them may be in the area of speculation, more needs to be done to understand these things. Now, I have a host of questions here, and I said, ask them to write down and send. After looking at the handwriting in some, I wish I'd asked them to come to the mic and explain. Yeah, I'll do that. Now, okay, now somebody said that you are seeing younger patients with androgenetic alopecia. I think it was Sandeep. Why is it so? And then at the same time, if you see, the prevalence of androgenetic alopecia increases with age, and testosterone is supposed to decrease with age. So why should prevalence increase with age?
The second part of your question is that testosterone levels start reducing. Testosterone is produced at a very significant level till the 7th decade in most men. Testosterone levels don't drop drastically. They still remain in the normal range.
I'm sure a lot of people will be happy here.
Yes. The point is that you don't need a lot of testosterone to see. It is the way the androgen receptors work is temporally and spatially different for each person. So the receptor sensitivity may vary from person to person. So you may have somebody responding rapidly. So by the 2nd or 3rd decade, you'll have more pronounced hair loss, and somebody may start manifesting the hair loss later. But as you grow older, there is an element of senescence that comes in, which then complicates the issues. So many of the patients who are in the 4th or 5th decade may not respond as well to conventional therapy as they would respond to just, minoxidil or other therapies.
Now the first part, why is it being seen in younger individuals?
One of the reasons that I mentioned was there is a lot of connect between lifestyle changes that have happened in that generation compared to what was there maybe a few decades earlier. And there is no hard core connectivity that I've seen. But the inference that I can draw is that, like I told you, we are looking at the BMI for all our patients. And I'm seeing that the BMI in these patients are generally between 25 and 27. So which is on the overweight scale at that age, when their metabolism is really high.
Okay. Kumaresan, you touched your chest. I don't know whether to scratch or to say that you want me to ask you a question. What do you say for this? How do the epigenetic influences start occurring at an younger age group?
It's a gray area, and it's a lot of studies coming on this topic, sir. It could be anything from a lifestyle, diet, stress, everything contributes for the epigenetic changes, sir.
Okay. Is there what I'm asking here is PCOS is increasing. Dr. Richita, you can answer this. Young women, they're showing more PCOS.
I would like to answer your previous one. You said the question was very nice. With age, you see decline in testosterone levels, and despite how you get increased prevalence. The reason being is androgen receptor repeats. With the age, androgen receptor repeats increases. With the younger age, you have the low repeats, and then you don't see. But in even younger age, what you see is increased prevalence of androgenic alopecia is high nowadays because they are getting married later, and therefore they don't have the progeny. This is one theory I will propose forward by, I don't remember the article. Since they are not getting married, they don't have children, so that could be the possibility that they are getting as androgenic alopecia earlier.
You mean to say people should marry early?
Yes, earlier time it was earlier marriage, earlier children, and therefore...
And less baldness.
Yes, and then less
That's
baldness.
very interesting. Okay.
I'll use myself as a case. In 2006, my friend Vance Elliott and my assistant Amina Vance both looked at my scalp and said I was heavily miniaturized. I said, no, it cannot be. Looked at a photograph, my entire crown was miniaturized, my front was starting miniaturization. Of course, as a really good doctor, I refused to take medication. So I was way overweight. I was 205 pounds. I moved back from New York to Dallas. Diet was bad. I ate fast food once or twice a week. I lost 30 pounds. I still eat a lot. If you follow my Facebook, you'll see I still eat a lot. But I stopped eating fast food entirely. And I've tracked myself now for 14 years, and all of it's reversed with no therapy.
Thank you.
So I think the bottom line is there's a lot of toxins out there in our diet, and that's what we've heard.
Sandeep summary is marry early and prevent baldness.
Pardon me? No. The point is that there is a study that was published from Korea where they have documented a 5-year survey, and they have found that the incidence of male pattern hair loss is much, much earlier now as compared to what was recorded earlier. That is one. The other thing is that the pubertal changes that we are seeing in young boys, they are much more premature, means it is almost precocious. If you see, the menarche age has gone down drastically. So there is a link somewhere to an evolutionary change also.
By the way, how many here still are not married? If not, get married early. Anyway, I request the faculty to be brief in their comments so that we can take more questions. Dr. Lam, you touched upon this. Miniaturization in the occipital area, thinning in the occipital area, donor dominance, and how we are getting more and more cases of DUPA or like this reverse pattern hair loss. What's your comment? How does what explains this?
It's just, I think we underappreciate DUPA. And we have this arbitrary definition of 25% where personally I believe most cases have some level of miniaturization in the donor that we underrepresent. So I think that if we see even 5 or 10% miniaturization in the donor area and the person is, let's say, 50, I would be not so worried. But if they're even 10% miniaturization and they're 25, 30, and of course there's already a danger just operating on a 25-year-old or 30-year-old. But then you look at that early miniaturization, that miniaturization is not going to get better unless it's a dietary issue, but it's going to get worse. So we have to look at that and be careful.
Now, what explains this reverse pattern androgenic alopecia? Who can take this question? Look here, he's balding from below also. Where is his safe donor? You just can't make out what is safe here.
It's just part of it. I think retrograde alopecia up there is part of the encroachment on the safe donor area.
So, Kumaresan, now where is his lower occipital scalp derived from embryologically? if that is from a different source, isn't it?
Yes, sir. Sir, none of the safe donor area definition includes reverse thinning or diffuse thinning, sir. So that has to be redefined. We just blindly follow the safe donor area definition.
Okay.
None of them took into account about the reverse thinning till now.
Dr. Rajput, now, if you say that these kind of cases need to be managed first with drugs, nutrition, whatever, and you do strengthen them, you're not going to cure them of their defect forever. If you transplant after giving them, how are you sure that they're going to last?
So, first part I would like to comment first is that this incidence is higher and is coming in younger people from exposure to pollution, stress, altered sleep cycles, change in the circadian rhythm of the body, exposure to bright lights even after sunset. There are many, many things going into it. And if we have a miniaturization like this and we treat them or improve the quality of the hair before doing the transplant, what we are giving them is a care program. It's not a cure. It's a care program. So when we improve the quality of the hair by giving nutritional supplements before the transplant, they have to continue after the transplant as well. It's like we are giving them a sunscreen to be used whenever they want to go on the beach. It doesn't treat anything. Even if
So
we...
they have to continue it forever.
Yeah, they will have to continue this for a long time. Lot of our patients continue for a year, year and a half. After that, they just get bored of taking the supplements. So they stop
In
it.
other words, we are literally saying that these are no longer permanent hairs and you can't assure a permanent result after transplantation.
Yeah, you can't, because the hair is a mirror of your health. What is happening with the follicle, you can see it because this is the epithelial structure or a mini organ which is cycling faster than rest of the body. Okay. But your entire body is having those changes, and if you take these supplements, you feel wellness, improvement in all the parameters in your body. So most people will appreciate that and hang on to the care program.
Now, I will take some questions from the audience because that is equally important.
One quick comment is that I think you have to put
please.
in your consent forms that the transplanted hairs are not guaranteed to be permanent.
Well, one of the young fellows wrote to me that recently his number of cases has dropped down, and if we put that in the consent form, I think the number of cases will drop down further. Anyway, thank you. Now, this is for Dr. Rachita. If I can read this correctly, I think this is, I can't read the name.
What can be done to the sebaceous gland to prevent effluvium post-hair transplant? Now we came to know that there is a role of sebaceous gland in the hair biology. So how we can apply this fact that during the transplant, what care we can take?
So in my opinion, when the damages are grave, when the graft quality is poor, when the graft is remain outside for a longer period of time, when you don't supplement with your good holding solution, these are the things you should take care, because anyway we are cutting the APM muscle. We can't do anything for that. So rest of the thing you have to improve the perfusion and reduce the reperfusion injury as much possible as you can.
The same thing as the graft means the injury.
Dr. Rachita, if you see this diagram, and with the kind of punches that are used in FUE, 0.8, 0.9, sometimes even 0.7, it's impossible not to damage the sebaceous gland because it is quite big.
Yes, yes.
So, what is the influence of that? In a FUT graft on a strip graft under microscopic dissection, we tend to keep them a bit chubby. So, probably their sebaceous gland is preserved partly. This is the question actually sent by Kumareshan. But in an FUE, particularly very small grafts, it has to get damaged.
Yes. So we have done one in-house study where we have studied graph of 0.9 versus graph of 1.5 mm, and we have seen the sebaceous gland is bigger. You get a more size of sebaceous, complete sebaceous gland in 1.1. So I would prefer to go instead of 0.9 is a standard punch is being used universally. Nobody now uses 0.8 and 0.7 unless you want one single hair. But I would prefer to go like 1 mm at least in FUE.
With 1 mm, the
instead
kind
of
of scar
0.9.
that would be produced, perhaps then we will negate some of the advantages of FUE.
No, 0.9 and 0.1 mm scars doesn't matter that much. But
Well,
it matters
I think
for graph.
This,
It doesn't matter that much, then it matters for your graft.
If you reduce or increase the 0.1 mm, the graft harvesting will be affected by the 20%.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is.
And
It
not
is-
only that,
yes.
because of the stretch.
Yeah, but the quality of graph and your improvement in your graph would be many folds.
It's not just the diameter. You stretch the skin when doing FUE,
Yeah.
the circular hole becomes oval,
Yes.
and that area is much larger.
Much larger.
It is not even 20%, it is even more. But anyway, this can be taken up during the size of the punches, the discussion on FUE. But there is one more point. In miniaturization, the sebaceous gland size increases. In a miniaturized hair, the gland is much larger.
Yeah.
And that is supposed to be because the DHT
Yes.
also is acting on the sebaceous
Correct.
gland and is increasing the size. So what is the relevance of that here?
Yeah. So when you say that is a size of sebaceous gland is larger and when during the miniaturizer process, that means it is good? No, it is not good. You take it as a thyroid, hypothyroidism. When you have the low function of thyroid gland, you get increase in thyroid gland. It is a compensatory mechanism. So how long a tissue will survive for the compensatory mechanism? It has to die. Over time, it keep on doing the extra work. And this is a mechanism for that.
Thank you. Now, next question. This is role of cyclical nutrient therapy. Dr. Rajput, you are here. Why should it be cyclical? Why can't you give it daily? Apart from just a practical convenience, what is the advantage?
The use of nutrients has got a very thin safe margin as far as the hair cycles are concerned. So we know that excess vitamin A can cause hair loss instead of hair growth. Excess consumption of omega-3 can lead to excessive lipid peroxidation. The lipid peroxidation will create free radicals and ROS, which will again suppress the growth of the hair. But we want omega-3 or we want vitamin A for good hair growth as well. Now it is just traditional and taken for granted that anything you take has to be taken 7 times a week. It has never been proven that this is necessary to be taken 7 times a week.
So
Yes,
what you are
yes.
saying is, it's cyclical because it is not necessary to be daily.
Yeah, it is not necessary to be taken in high doses, and if you keep on taking these in high doses, it reduces the efficiency of the nutrients.
Thank you. Now, this is a question by Dr. Vivek Saxena to Dr. Samuel Lamb. What do you mean by recipient influence in terms of molecular physiology, whatever? It is vaguely said it is recipient influence, but what does it mean? Is that what you are trying to say, Vivek, or is there anything else that you wanted to say?
No, I want to say, Dr. Sam, you have a very nice presentation that you are saying there is a recipient area dominance or an inclusion on the transplanted hair. The transplanted hair fall off in the subsequent year. Now, what I want to say, every day we used to face question, what is the life of transplanted hair? Do they fall under recipient influence? Because if the difficulty is in the recipient zone, they will also fall. So, sir, we used to consult that 90% of the cases, they are not affected by genes, but of the remaining 10% of the cases, these transplanted hair may also fall. And among one of the very important factor, what we are missing right now, not mentioned yet, I think is age-related senile degeneration. That means as the age advances,
What is
your
the
color of
question?
the face falls, your face develops wrinkle. In the same way, these hair, even the donor area, they also get miniaturized. So your transplanted hair will fall under age-related, they will also become denaturized, and suppose they have a definite lifespan, they will also fall. So
Vivek,
in
what
my-
is the question, please?
the question is, age-related senile degeneration has not been mentioned. It need to be considered, and it is, I don't think, more of a recipient dominance, more of the epigenetic factor, which leads to subsequent
Thank
hair
you. You
loss.
should have been a panelist here. Thank you. Now, this question here, Dr. Sam, you look at this photo. This is a photograph after grafting. Some hairs remain thin, while some hairs have grown thicker. Some hairs are very small. These are all grafted hairs. Why does that happen?
It could be many reasons. It could be partially transected hairs that causing the hairs not to grow well. It could be progressive miniaturization just in the recipient bed. It could just be hairs that are miniaturizing over time. I mean, the problem is we don't know. I mean, there's so many, to me, it's all of the variable factors that are involved with this.
Okay, now next is, this is, I think, Asim, you can take this. How does the oral retinoids and local retinol affect the hair growth?
So, oral vitamin A, like we mentioned, it's necessary for epithelial integration and keratinocyte differentiation. But if it goes in a higher dose, which occurs in retinoids, when you have a higher concentration of vitamin A, it can actually disrupt the epithelium and cause hair loss. That is why retinoid-induced alopecia is a common norm. But there is, with topical retinoids, there is a positive effect which happens. Topical retinoids do activate the sulfotransferase pathway. So minoxidil, when it's given with retinoids, actually the effect of minoxidil is almost doubled with that because it upregulates that pathway, and so the sulfation of minoxidil is more pronounced than it would be without
Yeah,
with
I asked
topical
this question
retinoids.
only for this sake. So where minoxidil by itself doesn't work, combining it with retinoic acid perhaps will help. The only issue is then the irritation which has to be taken care of. Thank you.
Can I just say something to this?
Yeah.
Sulfotransferase expression varies from person to person. So that will not change by addition of retinoid because whatever is there will be there. But in some people, the levels of sulfotransferase present, it's ubiquitous in the body.
It's all over. But
It's
the
a very
SALT 1A1
crucial
is the
enzyme.
one which is specific to the hair follicle.
Dr. Satur, we had done the study of sulfotransferase enzyme. There are 4 studies done to see the prevalence of this enzyme in Indian population, and we found that 40% of the Indian population have deficiency of this enzyme. Then we had done the study, another is application of retinoic acid, and we have seen those having a lower salt transmit at baseline, they got increased to the higher one, above the normal one, the threshold. And the third study we had done is that oral aspirin. If those are taking oral aspirin, in then the sulfotransferase enzyme is lower. So we had done the baseline normal, we gave them as oral aspirin for 15 days, and then we have again done this study.
Thank you.
In
So
fact,
the
just,
summary is that this enzyme is perhaps important, the way it is expressed, and adding retinoic acid to minoxidil is an interesting possibility if somebody can come up with a very tolerable preparation. Right. Now, Asim, this is for you from Dr. Patwardhan. Are the blood level studies done to prove about biotin, vitamin C, D3, vitamin E, etc.? I
So,
think you did show some couple of studies. there.
I did. So the blood levels for biotin I had showed. Most of the studies have disproved that biotin would have any positive effect unless there is biotin deficiency. That is the only clause that the 3 studies that I showed mention, that unless and until there is a biochemical biotin deficiency, that is the only situation in which biotin supplements would work.
Okay. Now, regarding nutrition, Dr. Rajesh, lot was talked about all these micronutrients. What about proteins? Hair is entirely protein, and nothing much was discussed. And particularly vegetarians in India, the quality of proteins that they get, the amount that they get. So, what do you say for that? And yeah,
Protein again is a double-edged sword. You require proteins as building blocks for the DNA and cell repair and most of the cell cycles, internal enzyme cellular functions. But the moment you start consuming protein in excess, you require certain essential amino acids. But overall, if you're consuming proteins in excess, it makes the blood pH acidic because of the amino acid levels going high. And then there is reabsorption of calcium from the system to buffer these proteins, and you start getting calcium excretion through the urine. So again, the reason why we want to go cyclical. We include amino acids in the cyclical treatment program, but they are given only twice a week.
what
One-
about whey protein supplementation?
Yeah, whey protein, the biological utility index of the whey protein is very high. So I would suggest people who are taking whey protein for bodybuilding to take it twice or thrice a week, not more than 2 to 3 times a week. You can do everything in moderation. Each nutrient has got a good role, but there's a thin line between it being food and changing to poison.
Now,
Yeah, excess is to be taken according to your body requirement, 0.9 per kg body weight, and then you watch. Now, the end result or the outcome you're seeing depends on the sensitivity of your hair follicles. There are people who will be taking excess proteins, having luxurious hair, it doesn't matter for them. But if you're having hair loss and if you're having miniaturization or early thinning, then these are the things you need to take care of. It's like every smoker won't get lung cancer. But if you have a tendency of lung cancer in your family, of course, you can't start smoking. It's
okay,
that
now
way.
regarding this whey protein, much was made told about metabolic syndrome, obesity. What about exercise? What does it do for hair growth or
Pardon
hair
me?
loss? Exercise.
Uh,
Does
Exercise
it do something
depends on the
directly?
type of exercise. Studies have been profiled for these Olympic rowing team, and they found that if there is high intensity resistance training, you find a lot of increase in the testosterone levels. It is a very small spike, but it is there. If you see secondary hypogonadism patients who are senior citizens, one of the things as a treatment is given to them is resistance training, which upregulates, increases the testosterone secretion. So from a perspective of testosterone levels, resistance training, which is very high intensity, very regular, and for a longer duration, will definitely increase the testosterone levels. Studies have shown a mixture of aerobic exercise and resistance training, on an alternate day basis is much more beneficial than only resistance training in patients with respect to testosterone levels.
I think it's partly also because the sex hormone binding globulin levels could go up in the blood with increasing protein, and that could carry more testosterone in the circulation, and that could lead to more muscle mass as well as hair growth. Now, I think we still have time. We started early, so we'll keep this going. Now, what about creatine? Creatine or carnitine? What did you want to say, Mayank? Now, he has a question here. Branch chain amino acids, gym supplements, and creatine. They give a powder. What does it contain? Carnitine, isn't it?
Pardon me?
Creatine? They give creatine powder? Yeah. So, what about it?
So it's like using anabolic steroids, and most of these gym supplements are unregulated, and they contain something called as the bodybuilding complex. Something, it's never declared what is exactly there in that complex. So mainly it contains anabolic steroids, and again you have to be careful. Just I said, watch the kind of hair and hair growth you are having. The moment you are having thinning or hair loss, or you find the hairline is receding, there is miniaturization, and you are on gym supplements, you need to go down on it. If you're doing gym supplements, you're a bodybuilder, you got luscious hair, don't worry about it. So, because individual cell response and individual body response is differing for the follicles, you have to be careful, watch out, and this can be one of the red flags to control your lifestyle or control your gym supplements if you are having hair loss.
Okay, now this is from Dr. Amanduva to Dr. Rachita. How is seborrhea and AGA, how are they linked?
There are many papers on that seborrheic dermatitis and even psoriatic dermatitis can cause cicatricial alopecia. There are different types of the alopecia. One is a scarring alopecia and non-scarring alopecia. And this is a paper because there is an inflammation which can trigger some changes in hair bulge area. So we had to treat seborrhea also.
A related question. Now we see, you want to ask something, Dr.
Yeah, just one thing, that how come like sometimes a lot of AGA patients have more dandruff? So do you think that that dandruff is linked to AGA in the sense that we keep telling our patients that no, it is just, the same pathogenic mechanism. They say jab se dandruff hua tab se hair fall hua. I mean, both the things are linked.
I'm not telling the dandruff can lead to AGA, but dandruff can lead to the hair loss.
Yeah,
So
it
that's a
can-
different mechanism.
But in androgenetic alopecia,
Yes.
how is seborrhea related that way?
So it's a combination. It's not like that in androgenetic alopecia. As per se, the patient is not having androgenetic alopecia, and if you have the dandruff, you will see that many patients will complain of hair loss, but then they will not have the androgenetic alopecia. So when it is a combination, is androgenetic alopecia also there, and your dandruff is there, that is the both
So what I mean is
combination.
inflammation in the sebaceous glands
Yes,
could also lead to some hormonal local changes.
local changes.
A related question. We get a lot of pityrosporum, Dr. Rachita.
Pardon?
Pityrosporum folliculitis,
Pardon, I didn't get it.
recurrent folliculitis of the scalp.
Yeah.
Pityrosporum folliculitis. They come for a hair transplant.
Yes.
Now, at least I have had one case wherein that patient kept getting folliculitis later, even though adequate therapy was given, and he did not get a good result. I'm sure many of us will have faced questions like that. So what is the relation of that? Is that again contributing to inflammation and that leading to the...
In that, I would think of that is when a recurrent folliculitis, it is acute insult and the recovery is very fast. than a chronic disease where recovery is a longer. So detrimental effect is more when the disease is a chronic than it is acute. That is my just logical explanation to that.
You want to say something?
So seborrhea is a marker of inflammation. It's a marker of microinflammation. It alters the immune signature. That is why we give ketoconazole to reduce the P folliculitis colonization, to in turn reduce seborrhea. And like you mentioned, in smaller hair follicles, even in vellus hair or miniaturized hair, the sebaceous gland is, in miniaturized hair, not in vellus, the sebaceous gland is larger in size. So it is actually producing more oil because it's still undergoing the action of DHT. So that is my take on it.
Yes. Okay, now, I think we have finished questions from the audience. I still have a little bit of time. Kumaresan, you mentioned about tests to predict AGA and also tests for predicting response to treatment, right?
Yes, sir.
Now, supposing you do find that he doesn't respond to minoxidil, he doesn't respond to finasteride, what do you do?
Sir, genetic tests are an option for us. This can be like.
No, what is the practical utility?
Sir, it's little expensive. But for research, we can do a study. It becomes a little cost effective. But on a practical value, if it's cost effective, then we can utilize this, sir.
Yeah.
This will be useful.
We had done a pilot study for this when the gene testing was available. We did 10 patients where we checked the CAG repeats, and a lower CAG repeat correlates with androgen sensitivity. So it's a predictor for possibility of developing androgenetic alopecia, prostate enlargement, and also response to finasteride. Even with patients with lower CAG repeats, we didn't see that the finasteride response was as much as what the prediction was given as a part of the test. No, it didn't correlate so well.
All right, now one more thing before we close up. What about the role of smoking in androgenetic alopecia? Anybody?
We have a publication on smoking and the benefit of cyclical therapy in androgenetic alopecia with smokers. So we are all talking about accumulation of toxins and free radicals and the ROS which are mediating. In smoking, one thing is you get direct load of ROS. You're going to get higher amount of ROS. It causes some kind of vasculitis or vascular reaction where the end capillaries that are supplying the hair follicle are getting blocked. So it causes ischemia in the scalp, ischemia in the follicles. Also, smoking affects the utilization of antioxidants, vitamin C and many other nutrients in the body. So smoking affects hair loss in multiple ways. And we have had people who said, I quit smoking and gone on the nutritional correction and scalp care and got back reversal of miniaturization in a very significant amount.
Thank you. Now, that was a very good discussion. Let me just summarize it for those who are recording. One, multiple factors are operating, and if any of you disagree with my summary, feel free to tell that. Multiple factors are okay. There are other influences other than androgens from yes or no. We all agree that it is yes, but perhaps more research needs to be done. Do we agree on that? Yes. Okay. Age related to Galia aponeurotica. Yes, no, maybe. I think at this stage it has to be maybe. A lot of this will be maybe only. Role of sebaceous gland, perhaps it is necessary for growth. Yes, no, maybe. Again, maybe. Recipient influence. Yes, no, maybe. Again, maybe. I think it's very easy to summarize this session. Importance of proteins. Yeah, it is important, but as Rajput said, it's a double-edged sword. So don't overdo it. Smoking, it has certainly a role, definitely. So these are the summaries. One summary he has missed out: marry early to prevent androgenetic alopecia. Thank you very much. So it has been a delightful panel discussion.
Thank you to the entire panel for an excellent discussion. Now there's a short. A moment. Yeah.
So now I request the panelists to be here.
Yeah.
I think we have some mementos.
Yes.
Yeah. I invite the President, Dr. Dhami, to come out of the stage, please.
Sir, please. Dhami, sir, please. After this is a short tea break of 15 minutes. So we'll resume our session on 10:45 sharp. So request all delegates to be back at 10:45. Dr. Sandeep Satur, sir. Dr. Kumresan. Dr. Rachita Dhurat. Dr. Lam. Dr. Rajput, sir. Dr. Asim Shem. Dr. Venkat, sir.